The new girl kept her head down. That was Katie Morrison's strategy for surviving Oak Creek Memorial in Denver: arrive early, chart quietly, leave without being noticed. 3 days into her first week, she'd mastered the rhythm of the ICU: rounds at 6:30, vital signs at 8, medication passes at 10. She moved through the sterile hallways like water through a pipe, efficient and invisible, her scrubs perfectly pressed, her badge clipped precisely where hospital policy demanded. The antiseptic smell of the unit had burned her nostrils by the second day. That sharp chemical bite of bleach and isopropyl alcohol mixed with something underneath, something like copper and old fear. Katie didn't mind it. She'd smelled worse in places that didn't have fluorescent lights or heart monitors. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, beep beep, beep beep, a percussion section keeping time over the hospital's baseline hum. She moved between rooms in methodical sequence. Room for 12, check the 4. Room for 15, assess the post-op dressing. Room for 18, document the output. She was exactly who she needed to be: competent, invisible, unremarkable. The limp was barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. The shrapnel had lodged in her left hip almost 4 years ago, a fragment of IED shrapnel that the Army surgeons at Bagram had managed to extract without hitting the femoral artery. The physical therapist said she was lucky. Katie understood luck the way a combat medic understands it: a metric, a measurement, something you could quantify in milliliters of blood loss or seconds until cardiac arrest. The limp was what remained of being lucky on a Tuesday in Helmand Province. Dr. Harrison Hargrove noticed her on the 3rd day, but not because she was remarkable. He noticed her because of how her hands moved. The code blue alarm sounded at 7:47 in the morning during what should have been a routine post-op check on a 63-year-old woman recovering from a colostomy revision. Her O2 sat was dropping: 88, then 84, then 79. The rhythm on the monitor became erratic, jittery, the pattern of someone whose lungs were betraying them. Tension pneumothorax, Katie knew before anyone spoke. The collapsed lung was compressing the heart, the air accumulating in the pleural space with no way to escape, pressure building like a hydraulic system about to rupture. The room filled with bodies. 2 respiratory therapists. A resident whose hands trembled slightly as he reached for a needle. Hargrove himself, walking in with his white coat unbuttoned, his shoulders angled in the posture of a man accustomed to authority the way other men wore watches. Katie was already there, had been checking the post-op labs, and she simply moved without thinking. 12 years of muscle memory. 3 tours through fobs where triage meant life or death in 90 seconds. Her hands reached for the needle decompression kit, the 14-gauge angiocath needle, and located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, on the woman's chest. The insertion was clean. Efficient. The hiss of air escaping as pressure released from the pleural space, that sound like a held breath finally exhaled. O2 sat climbing. 81, 87. 92, stable. The resident blinked. The respiratory therapist stopped mid-adjustment to the ventilator. Hargrove's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched Katie's hands finish taping the needle in place, her movements precise as a surgeon's despite the fact that she was wearing a standard blue scrub cap and the kind of face that belonged on a missing person poster from a small town no one had heard of. "Good work," Hargrove said, but his voice sounded like a man checking something off a list of things that didn't add up. He turned and walked out of the room, and Katie went back to checking vital signs as if her hands hadn't just saved someone from a collapsed lung and cardiac arrest. The thing Hargrove noticed next was worse than how her hands moved. It was what she saw. The ICU billing system was old, networked through a workstation near the main nurse's station, and Katie had been assigned to document the medication administration record for a patient in room 407, a routine painkiller dispensation at 10:48 a.m. She logged in with her credentials, just hired Nurse Morrison K, and the screen pulled up the march. That's when she saw it. The phantom codes. Dr. Hargrove had been running inflated billing through the ICU for 18 months, maybe longer. Katie saw it the way a combat medic sees an arterial bleed in a crowd of casualties. Her eye caught the pattern before her conscious mind had time to argue. Procedure codes for thoracic surgeries never performed. ICU bed fees multiplied, duplicated, running parallel to actual patient stays. Diagnostic imaging charges that didn't match any ordered tests. The numbers were large and organized and systematic, which meant they weren't mistakes. They were architecture. She didn't access the files. She didn't even look at them directly. But her finger hovered over the billing terminal for exactly 32 seconds, and her eyes moved across the screen in the way of someone reading something she wasn't supposed to see. Hargrove was sitting at his desk in the corner of the ICU, the glass-walled office where he could watch the floor, and he saw that hesitation. The way her finger paused. The slight shift in her body posture. The recognition that flickered behind her eyes like a candle anyone could read if they were watching carefully enough. He was watching. A vein tightened in Hargrove's jaw. He was a man who had built 17 years of career on a specific arrangement, a network of board members, hospital administrators, and insurance liaisons who understood that a certain level of discretion was profitable for everyone involved. The coding he ran through Katie's new unit generated approximately $820,000 annually, money that moved in quiet patterns to retirement accounts and investment portfolios and a cabin in Aspen that was titled under an LLC that existed on paper only. And a girl who'd been on the payroll for 3 days had just spotted it. Hargrove pulled up Katie's file on his desktop. Catherine Morrison, RN, BSN from a state school, 3 years at a small clinic in Wyoming, no red flags in her background check, no published papers, no academic affiliations that would suggest someone naturally inclined toward investigation. Her previous employment history was thin but not suspicious. Her references had been contacted by HR and returned acceptable evaluations. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that should have equipped her to identify a billing scheme at a glance. Nothing that should have given her the kind of technical knowledge to understand what she was looking at. He picked up his desk phone and made 3 calls. The first was to Raymond Chen, a board member with whom Hargrove had shot 18 holes of golf every 3rd Friday for the past 11 years. The second was to Susan Du Bois, who oversaw hospital policy and compliance and who had received exactly 4 referrals from Hargrove's ICU in the past 2 years, cases he'd carefully built and handed to her office because that was how the arrangement worked. The third call was to Marcus Whitfield, the hospital's official investigator, a man who had never once found anything worth pursuing when Hargrove had suggested that perhaps a certain staff member required attention. "We may have a compliance issue," Hargrove said to each of them, his voice carefully measured. "A new hire in the ICU. I want to make sure we're protected before any misunderstandings occur." The calls took 14 minutes total. By the time Katie Morrison finished her shift at 3 o'clock that afternoon, the institutional machinery had already begun to turn. She touched the unit patch as she walked to her car, running her fingers along the faded stitching on the inside of her jacket lining. The patch was from Marja, from the 75th Ranger Regiment, from a time when she'd been known by a call sign instead of a first name. She did this every day, a small ritual that most people would recognize as prayer if they understood what prayer meant to someone who'd held a tourniquet and a flashlight in the same hand while teaching a private how to pack a wound. The patch was still there. The stitching was still holding. She could disappear into Denver like she'd disappeared into every other hospital where she'd worked in the past for years. Keep her head down, move through the hallways like water, leave before anyone asked questions that had answers she couldn't give. The classified part of her service record was still classified. The Syria operation was still buried. The 14 months she'd spent running off-book medevac operations with a forward surgical team that technically didn't exist existed only in the memories of people scattered across military bases from Camp Lejeune to Al-Assad. Those people weren't talking. But Katie had taken this job because Denver was where nobody looked for her. Because Oak Creek Memorial had old systems and limited oversight. Because she'd spent 3 years living quietly in Wyoming, and now she was ready to be invisible in a city where anonymity was the default setting, where a woman could work 16-hour shifts and no one would ask where she'd learned to move the way she moved or why her hands knew things her mouth would never confirm. She'd been wrong about something, though. She'd been wrong about how long it would take someone to notice. The next morning, Dr. Hargrove gathered the entire surgical team for rounds. 12 staff members assembled outside the ICU, residents, nurses, attending physicians, all waiting for his usual brief on the day's cases. But this wasn't usual. Katie stood at the periphery, charts in hand, still new enough to stand back and listen rather than speak. Hargrove's eyes found her immediately. "I'm making a public bet," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a man who'd never been told no. "Our new girl here won't last the week. Any takers?" He smiled, looking around the room as if he'd just offered a drink. "Nothing personal, sweetheart, but you've got that look. The kind that quits when the pressure starts." A few residents laughed, the nervous kind, the kind that came from watching power test its weight. Katie didn't move. Her face stayed level, unreadable as stone. But her jaw tightened. Just barely. Just enough that she felt it. She was new to Oak Creek Memorial, but she'd learned in 6 days that Hargrove was the kind of man who needed an audience for his cruelty. It made it real to him, somehow. Made him feel solid. That afternoon in the cafeteria, Katie sat at a corner table with a bowl of tomato soup and a turkey sandwich. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm overhead. She'd pulled her hair back in a bun, scrubs still damp from the morning shift. Hargrove walked past her table, moving between conversations, working the room the way successful people do. He appeared to brush her shoulder. His elbow caught her tray. Soup splashed, red and steaming, across her scrubs, onto her hands, pooling on the floor. The clatter of the bowl echoed across the cafeteria. "Clumsy," Hargrove said, not stopping, not turning around. But loud enough for the room to hear. "Better clean that up before someone slips." Conversations died. Katie watched the liquid spread across the linoleum tile, seeping into the grout lines. She could have stood up. Could have walked away. Could have let someone else handle it. Instead, she found paper towels, knelt down, and wiped the floor in slow, methodical movements while the cafeteria watched. No one helped. No one spoke. By the time she finished, Hargrove was already gone. The next day, rounds in the ICU. Katie had prepared the charts for 5 patients, documentation clean, notes precise, vital sign trends highlighted for quick review. She stood near the nursing station as Hargrove approached with 2 residents trailing behind him like pilot fish. He didn't ask for the charts. Didn't reach for them. He pointed at her feet instead. "Pick that up, sweetheart." She was holding the charts in her hands. His meaning was unmistakable. He wanted them on the floor. In front of everyone. Katie hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she set the charts down on the tile herself, knelt, and gathered them up again. The medical assistants pretended to work. A resident suddenly became very interested in a wall monitor. Hargrove smiled. "Or is bending over too much for someone with your limited experience?" His voice had that edge now, the one that said he was enjoying this. That this wasn't about efficiency or hospital protocol. This was about testing whether she'd break. Katie took one measured breath. She lowered herself to one knee, gathered the charts, and stood. A single tear escaped down her cheek, not from fear, not from shame, but from something else entirely. Something that felt like a pressure valve releasing. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. Hargrove's smile tightened as he saw her eyes. That's when he realized. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't backing down. She was looking at him the way a person looks at a problem they've already solved. "I've been on my knees in worse places for better reasons, doctor." The room went dead silent. The ventilator in bed 3 wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the only sound left in the ICU. Hargrove's face flushed, not the red of anger, but the crimson of a man watching his strategy collapse in real time. He'd expected her to cry harder, to apologize, to ask for mercy. Instead, she'd turned his cruelty into her testimony. He turned and walked away, his jaw working silently. But the look in Katie's eyes had done something worse to him than any outburst could have. It had shown him she had nothing to lose. That night, Hargrove sat in his office at 11 p.m., surrounded by the soft glow of his computer screen. His office was the kind that announced success: leather chairs, a view of downtown Denver, diplomas from Stanford and Johns Hopkins framed on the wall. He pulled up his email and began making calls. First to an investigator he'd fed cases to for 3 years, a man who owed him favors. Then to a hospital board member who'd taken 13 golf trips on Hargrove's dime, each one a $12,000 weekend that disappeared into unmarked expense reports. Hargrove had files on people. It was how he'd survived 32 years in medicine. He opened a new folder on his computer. Morrison, K. Inside, he began documenting everything. A note about how she'd corrected him during the Reeves procedure, insubordination. A comment about how her needle technique was unconventional, possibly unsafe. He flagged 3 charting entries as inconsistencies. None of it would survive scrutiny. All of it would stick if repeated often enough. She had to go before she looked too closely at those phantom billing codes. Then at 4 a.m., the trauma alert came through. Tension pneumothorax, incoming by ambulance. Commander James Reeves, Navy SEAL, crushed lung, oxygen saturation dropping. Katie heard the call on the intercom and moved without thinking, always without thinking. That was the thing about her. She moved like someone who'd been trained to move. Like a body that responded to crisis the way other bodies responded to breath. She prepped the needle decompression kit. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Everything in its place. The syringe, the alcohol wipe, the tape. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this before. Not in a training video. Not on a simulation model. Her muscle memory knew this. Hargrove arrived moments later, still buttoning his shirt, already annoyed at being called in. He took position at Reeves' head while Katie stood ready with the equipment. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, she said quietly. Hargrove positioned the needle too low, his hands moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd spent the last 5 years mainly signing charts. Katie watched Reeves' oxygen saturation dropping, 68, now 65, watched his chest caving inward like the ribs were made of paper. She stepped forward without asking permission. "You're too low, doctor." Hargrove's eyes flashed. But he adjusted. The needle slid in. Air hissed out like the last breath of a dying animal. Reeves gasped, color flooding back into his face. His oxygen saturation climbed. 72, 78. 85, climbing back to where it needed to be. And then Reeves' hand shot out with startling strength, grabbing Katie's wrist mid-suture. His eyes locked onto hers, wide with something that looked impossible. Recognition. Memory. Fear. "Bagram, 2019, he whispered, voice hoarse from the tube. "I watched you do a field thoracotomy with a Leatherman. You held the rib spreader with your bare hands." His grip tightened. "You're the one who pulled Mitchell out." Katie's face went white. Her wrist felt like it was burning. She pulled free, stepped back, her hands trembling now in a way they hadn't trembled since this morning. The only time her composure had cracked. "You're mistaken, Commander. I've never been to Afghanistan." But Reeves kept staring, even as the sedation pulled him under. "Senior Chief Morrison," he murmured. "I never forgot." His eyes closed. The monitors beeped on. Hargrove caught every word. Every single word. An hour later, in his office again, Hargrove searched military databases. Senior Chief Morrison. Navy SEAL. Afghanistan. But the results came back empty. No record. No service history. Nothing. Just a blank wall where a person should be. His hands went cold. A nurse with a classified background. A nurse who'd just been recognized by a Navy SEAL commander. A nurse who'd corrected his procedure and been right. A nurse who could spot phantom billing codes and didn't flinch when publicly humiliated. He picked up his phone and called the hospital board chairman. "We need to discuss Katie Morrison's credentials," he said quietly. "I have concerns about her background." The ambulance doors burst open at 4:17 a.m. Paramedics wheeled the stretcher through the Oak Creek Memorial entrance with the practiced urgency of a team that had done this 1,000 times, but Katie knew from the way they moved, the precision, the economy of motion, that this patient was different. This patient mattered. The man on the stretcher was Commander James Reeves, and his left lung had collapsed like a failed building. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of injury that kills you in minutes if you let it. Katie was 3 rooms away, charting the night's admissions, when she heard the call over the intercom. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 1. She didn't think. Her feet moved toward the sound before her mind caught up, a reflex burned into muscle memory from places the hospital didn't know about. Dr. Hargrove was already there, hands moving through the pre-surgical checklist with the casual confidence of a man who had never doubted his own competence. His eyes flicked up as Katie pushed through the doors, and something flickered across his face, irritation, maybe, or the territorial recognition of a predator noticing another predator in his hunting ground. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. She moved to the side of the bay, and the surgical nurse, a woman named Chen who'd worked at Oak Creek for 7 years, quietly stepped back. Just a subtle shift. Just enough space for Katie to slide into position. It was the kind of small grace that meant everything. The commander's breathing was shallow, panicked. His skin had that waxy grey pallor that came with blood loss and oxygen starvation. Reeves' eyes darted between the medical team, searching for something, control, maybe, or just a face that promised he wouldn't die on this stretcher in Denver. The ventilator would handle the breathing, but first they had to get the air out of his chest cavity. The needle decompression was standard trauma protocol, but Hargrove moved like a man performing for an audience. His movements were all theater, deliberate, almost choreographed. He turned to Katie without looking at her. "Get me the 14-gauge needle. Now." It wasn't a request. It was the kind of command that reminded everyone in the room who held the power. Katie was already moving. The needle was in her hand before he finished speaking, and she passed it to him with the kind of synchronization that came from either long experience or instinct so finely tuned it looked like choreography. Hargrove found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the textbook location, and the needle went in with a whispered hiss of escaping air. The commander's breathing eased almost immediately. His oxygen saturation, which had been tanking on the monitor, ticked upward. 82, 85, 87, stable. But the hiss wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The real procedure, the emergency thoracotomy, would happen in OR. They had maybe 5 minutes to move him. The stretcher rolled. Hargrove walked alongside it, barking orders like a conductor controlling an orchestra, and Katie moved with them because that's what you did when a man was dying in front of you. The fluorescent light streaked overhead, each one a moment, a heartbeat, a measurement of how much time was left. The elevator doors opened. The OR corridor stretched before them like a tunnel. Reeves' eyes found Katie's for just a second, and there was something in that moment, a flicker of recognition, maybe, or just the primal gratitude of a dying man seeing someone who looks capable. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then looked away. The operating room was already prepped. Instruments laid out in geometric precision. The anesthesiologist moved Reeves' head, and the endotracheal tube went in smooth and practiced. Propofol pushed. Rocuronium for paralysis. The commander's eyes closed. One moment he was conscious, terrified, human. The next he was a body, just anatomy, just a collapsed lung that needed fixing. Katie had learned to make that transition years ago, when it was kill or be killed and sentiment was a luxury that got people dead. Now it was just habit. Just the way the world worked in rooms like this. Hargrove's hands were steady as he opened the chest. The incision ran along the 5th rib, anterior axillary line, and Katie could see into the cavity before she should have been able to see anything at all. Blood. So much blood. She'd seen worse, had standing in desert sand while medics screamed orders and people died despite your best work, but something about watching it now, in fluorescent light, with a man she recognized bleeding out in front of her, made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Clamp," Hargrove said. Katie handed him the instrument. "Suction." She adjusted the angle. "Needle." "Smaller gauge." She was already reaching. The rhythm between them was wordless and absolute, the kind of synchronization that could only come from people who'd done this before, or from people who understood that hesitation meant death. The internal bleeding was controlled. The lung came into view. The damage was extensive but survivable if they moved fast enough. If they didn't make mistakes. If the man on the table didn't decide to die just to spite the universe's sense of irony. The sutures went in one by one. Hargrove's hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, and Katie's hands anticipated each move. Needle driver to him. Suction away from the field. Sponge to clear blood. Clamp to secure. The dance that kept people alive. But on the fourth suture, Reeves' hand moved. It was impossible. The man was paralyzed, anesthetized, unconscious, but his arm came up and his fingers wrapped around Katie's wrist with the grip of someone who'd spent a decade crushing steel. His eyes opened. That wasn't supposed to happen. The paralytic should have kept him frozen. The anesthesia should have locked him in darkness. But Reeves' eyes opened and his pupils found hers and his voice came out as a whisper that somehow cut through the beeping monitors and the ventilator's mechanical breath. Bagram. 2019, I watched you do a field thoracotomy with a Leatherman. He paused. His fingers tightened on her wrist. You're the one. The medic who wasn't supposed to exist. The room didn't go silent. The monitors kept their rhythm. The ventilator kept breathing for a man who couldn't. But something else went quiet, some essential part of the world that Katie had spent 18 years keeping in the dark. Hargrove's head snapped up. His eyes moved from Reeves to Katie's face and back again, and she could see the moment understanding landed like a punch. She could see the calculation spinning behind his eyes, the way he was reassessing everything, rewinding every interaction, every moment he dismissed her as just a nurse when she was something else entirely. Katie's jaw tightened. Just a small movement. Just a muscle contracting under her skin. She didn't pull her wrist away from the commander's grip. Didn't acknowledge what he'd said. Didn't let her voice change or her hand shake or her breathing alter by even a single beat. Her hands kept moving. The suture went in. The knot cinched. The next stitch began. She was a professional. She was controlled. She was the kind of person who could watch her entire history crack open on an operating table and not let anyone see her bleed. But Hargrove saw it anyway. He saw the moment between moments when her training made her invisible again, when she locked everything down behind eyes that had seen things his medical degree would never let him understand. He saw it and he knew. And knowing was the most dangerous thing in the world for a man who'd built his entire empire on the assumption that he understood the people he was destroying. The thoracotomy took 43 minutes. Reeves' lung was repaired. His chest was closed. His breathing was restored. He was alive because of the hands that moved through the procedure with the kind of muscle memory that came from doing a field thoracotomy with a Leatherman in the worst place on earth while trying to keep a perimeter alone. He was alive because Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Morrison had been trained by the Navy to save lives in conditions so extreme that civilian medicine looked like kindergarten. And now everyone in that room knew it. Katie removed her gloves as Reeves was wheeled to recovery. The latex peeled away from her hands, hands that had held guns and held wounds and held people together when holding was the only thing left. Hargrove was already on his phone, probably. Already making calls. Already building the narrative that would protect his fraud and bury her secret all over again. She could see it in the way he moved away from her, the way his eyes kept flicking back like he was trying to solve an equation that kept changing its variables. She touched the patch inside her jacket lining as she walked back toward the ICU. The faded unit patch from Marja. The one she'd kept sewn into the fabric of her civilian life, close to her heart, hidden from the world. It was still there. Still real. Still proof that somewhere in the records that had been erased, somewhere in the classified files that would never see daylight, she had been more than just a nurse. Now someone had seen her. And everything was about to change. At 2 a.m., the ICU doors burst open with the force of a man who'd already decided he was dying tonight. The attacker wasn't tall. Wasn't particularly large. But his eyes held the specific geometry of loss, the kind that turns a human being into a weapon. He screamed before anyone saw the knife. "The SEAL commander who killed my brother in Marja. Where is he?" His voice cracked on the last word like a teenage boy's, which made it worse somehow. Made it real. Nurses scattered. Code buttons didn't activate because nobody believed what was happening in an ICU where the worst thing was usually a dropped saline bag. The man's boots, work boots, mud-caked, splashed through the antiseptic slick floor. He moved toward Reeves' bed like he was walking through water, slow and inevitable. The hunting knife caught the fluorescent light, and in that glint, Katie Morrison made a choice in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She didn't think. Thought would have gotten him killed. Her body knew what to do. Muscle memory from a place that didn't officially exist took over. She was 3 beds away. 2 beds. 1. The man was raising the knife above Reeves' chest where the endotracheal tube exits were sutured. 1 strike and both lungs collapse, exsanguination in under 5 minutes. Katie stepped between them. Just stepped into the space where the blade was already falling. The knife entered just below her ribs like a surgeon's insert, precise, thermal, the sensation less of pain and more of absolute arrival. Hot. Overwhelming. Real. Her breath left her body in a sound she didn't recognize as her own voice. The attacker's face registered shock. He'd been expecting a man. He'd been expecting resistance from someone with training. He hadn't expected a woman in scrubs to simply absorb the impact. Katie twisted counterclockwise, using her body mass to turn the blade's trajectory away from Reeves' chest tubes. The plastic tubing ran like clear veins into his ribs. 1 puncture meant air in the pleural space. 1 puncture meant everything unraveling. She drove her elbow backward into the attacker's throat, not gentle, not measured, the kind of controlled violence that only comes from having practiced it thousands of times on mats in basements beneath bases that weren't on maps. He stumbled. The knife pulled free with a sensation like tearing cloth. Security arrived like they'd been waiting off stage. 3 officers, 2 of them tackling the man, 1 of them frozen, staring at Katie's hand pressed against her ribs where blood was already seeping between her fingers in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The wound was hot and getting hotter. She could feel it spreading, could assess it with the clinical distance of someone who'd treated worse on concrete under mortar fire, but this was her own blood and her own body and something about that changed the math. "Get him to psychiatric hold," she said, her voice perfectly steady. "Probable PTSD. Marja-connected loss." The resident, a young man, probably 3rd year, his eyes the size of serving plates, was running toward her. "Dr. Morrison, we need to get you to trauma." "I'm a nurse, not a doctor." Her hand was still on the wound. Blood was moving faster now. "Listen to me. We need a 14-gauge angiocath, pressure dressing, and we're checking for peritoneal penetration. This is a clinical exercise. Treat it like that." The resident's hand shook. "Hand steady," Katie said. It wasn't a request. "Your patient needs you present. Clamp here, at the anterior, pressure here, where the bleeding's heaviest. Watch for rigid abdomen. If you feel organ tissue, we call trauma. Until then, we manage it." She guided him through clamping her own bleeding the way she'd guided thousands of junior corpsmen through procedures in places where there were no surgeons for 40 miles. Her voice stayed level. Her breathing stayed controlled. She didn't look at Reeves, who was staring at her with the expression of a man watching someone use their body as a shield a second time. "Once in Bagram. Once here." The resident's hand steadied. The bleeding slowed. Katie counted the seconds, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then her knees made the decision her mind was trying to override. The floor came up. The last thing she saw was the resident's face, his mouth moving, words she couldn't quite. Darkness. She woke in a hospital bed 16 hours later, stitched and bandaged, with an IV running glucose and antibiotics into her left arm. The wound below her ribs was a long angry line of sutures. The pain was a baseline now, information rather than emergency. She could move. Breathing hurt but was possible. Catastrophe had been averted through a series of small medical interventions and one moment of terminal clarity. The door opened. Dr. Hargrove walked in like he owned the room. Like he'd been waiting for her to wake up. His expression was the kind of careful neutrality that meant he'd already been working behind the scenes, already had meetings scheduled, already had the narrative prepared. He wasn't panicked. That was the most terrifying part. He was smiling. The board and I have been discussing the incident, he said, standing at the foot of her bed. Not sitting. Standing in a position of authority like a judge. There's a significant protocol violation here. Unauthorized patient interference. You endangered yourself, which means you endangered everyone else in that ICU. One wrong move and you could have hit Reeves' chest tubes. Could have opened his pleural cavity. Could have gotten him killed, sweetheart. Katie didn't move. Her hand was on the bandage, pressing slightly, testing the integrity of the work the resident had done. The stitches held. Of course they did. She'd guided him through it. I saved Commander Reeves' life. You violated every safety protocol in this hospital, Hargrove said. His voice was smooth as oil. I've already spoken with 3 board members. 2 investigators are reviewing your performance file. Everything you've done since you started here is being examined. He paused. Let the silence settle. We're discussing suspension of your clinical privileges pending a full review. Katie kept her eyes on the window. Rain was hammering the glass like something alive. In a hospital this high up, you could see the city lights beyond the weather. Thousands of people down there, living lives where nobody tried to murder them at 2 a.m. She envied them. By end of day 2, Hargrove continued, your credentials will be suspended. You're not to enter the hospital in any clinical capacity. You have 24 hours to resign or we file the termination. Your choice. He reached the door. Paused. You're finished in medicine, Katie. You should have stayed down. He left before she could answer. The door clicked shut with the sound of finality. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came next. 1 week later, Katie was sitting in the VA hospital waiting room in Denver, surrounded by the ghosts of everywhere she'd been. A woman with prosthetic legs from an IED in Helmand. An older man with a tremor from a spinal injury in Kirkuk. A young Marine with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen the worst of human nature and was still processing the mathematics of survival. These were her people. These were the ones she'd held in operating tents and field stations and in the quiet dark spaces between life and death. None of them knew who she was. She was just a woman in civilian clothes with fresh stitches under her jacket. A patient. Another invisible person in a waiting room full of invisible people. No rank. No record. No official acknowledgement that she'd spent 18 years keeping other people breathing long enough to go home. Long enough to heal. Long enough to matter. The sound came without warning. Deep. Rhythmic. The subsonic thump of rotor wash that every bone in her body recognized before her conscious mind could process it. Katie's head snapped toward the window. Black Hawks. Plural. Not one, multiple aircraft, landing pattern suggesting tactical formation, rotors still spinning as they descended into Oak Creek Memorial's parking lot across the city. The waiting room went still. Every military person in that space recognized what was coming. Combat insertion didn't happen in Denver. Unless something had changed. A Navy SEAL team in full tactical gear walked through the VA hospital's main entrance like they decided gravity wasn't going to be a problem today. Black fatigues. Plate carriers with ceramic SAPI plates rated for 7.62 armor-piercing rounds. The lead operator had scars on both sides of his neck, survived, not lucky, the difference significant. His radio crackled. Angel 6 is en route. ETA 5 minutes. The receptionist stood up, then sat down, then stood up again. Can we help you? The lead operator's voice was flat authority. Senior Chief Morrison. Now. Everything moved at once after that. The VA hospital administrator was called. Katie's location was confirmed. A call went to Oak Creek Memorial. Dr. Hargrove's office was notified that a Navy SEAL team was actively searching for a nurse. Hargrove, Katie would learn later, turned white. She wasn't hard to find. She was in the waiting room, and within 20 minutes, a Navy captain was standing in front of her at attention, boots precise, jaw tight, the kind of bearing that comes from knowing you're about to change something. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Morrison, he said, and his voice carried across the waiting room like a command to an entire battalion. Every military person in that space turned. Every one of them rose, slowly, understanding, their bodies moving on instinct because rank recognizes rank across decades and theaters and silence. The woman in the waiting room wasn't a nurse. She wasn't invisible. She was something else entirely. Katie's hands trembled on the armrests. Not from fear. From the collision of two worlds finally becoming the same world. A lieutenant stepped forward, opening a folder with the kind of care you'd use for classified material. Which it was. 3 bronze stars, the lieutenant said. His voice cracked slightly. 2 purple hearts. Navy Cross for Valor in Marja, Helmand Province, 2010. He paused between each honor like he was reading a benediction. Senior Chief, you held a perimeter alone for 40 minutes while extracting 17 wounded personnel. 17 hostile forces engaged. 0 friendly casualties. A female commander Katie didn't recognize stepped closer. Her nameplate read Captain Chen. She opened a second file, and Katie could see the edge of her own photo, the one from SEAL Qualification School, before everything, before the classified operations, before the world decided she'd never existed. Call sign, Nightingale, Captain Chen said. For theater operations. Classified level beyond secret. Your service record was erased pending security review and reinstatement of clinical authority. The room was breathing as one organism now. The waiting room had become something else. Sacred space. The kind of space where ghosts become solid again. Then the doors opened. And a 2-star admiral walked through. The entire waiting room came to attention. The administrator who'd been summoned. The nurses. The janitorial staff who appeared from back corridors. Everyone. It wasn't a choice. It was biology. The presence of that much rank, that much command authority, that much living history was something that demanded physical response. The admiral was older, his hair silver, his posture the kind that comes from decades of carrying weight that civilians never see. He looked at Katie like he was confirming something. Then he turned to face the space behind him where Oak Creek Memorial's hospital administrator stood, white-faced. This facility attempted to silence a decorated senior enlisted operative who was about to expose fraud in the ICU billing system, the admiral said. His voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. Senior Chief Morrison saved Commander Reeves' life twice. Once in Bagram in 2019 under classified conditions. Once here, 3 days ago, preventing an assassination attempt while sustaining a significant stab wound below the ribs. The admiral looked at the administrator. Do you understand what almost happened? Sir. Dr. Hargrove said she violated protocol. Dr. Hargrove is currently being contacted by the FBI regarding phantom billing codes totaling $473,000, the admiral interrupted. His tone was conversational. Clinical. The kind of calm that precedes career termination. He will be removed from his position by end of business today. His medical license is being reviewed by the state board. And Senior Chief Morrison's credentials will be fully restored with an apology from this institution. The Admiral turned back to Katie. Your service record is declassified effective immediately. The patch inside your jacket, the one from the unit you kept sewn in your lining, we're returning that to official standing. You're no longer a ghost. Katie couldn't speak. The patch was there, still, faded from years of being pressed against her ribs beneath layers of scrubs and silence. She'd kept it the way soldiers keep photographs of people they can't officially acknowledge. It was the only piece of proof that the mission existed. That she existed. The Admiral extended his hand. Welcome home, Senior Chief, he said. Dr. Hargrove moved fast. By the time Katie woke in her hospital bed 16 hours after the stabbing, his network was already spinning. He walked into the boardroom at 7 in the morning with a fabricated file 3 inches thick, his voice steady as he painted the narrative. Unauthorized patient interference, he said, his manicured fingers tapping the folder. She inserted herself into an active security situation. Protocol violation. Risk to hospital liability. The board members, 3 of them he'd golfed with at Cherry Hills Country Club for the past 4 years, nodded along. They didn't ask questions. They already knew what he wanted. By noon, 2 federal investigators he'd fed cases to for 18 months were in the hospital's legal department, documenting Katie's pattern of deviation from standard procedure. The file Hargrove had been building all week was suddenly comprehensive. Shifted rotations. Unauthorized access to patient charts. A note he'd planted about her requesting early morning surgeries when the administrator wasn't present. None of it was real. All of it was carefully dated. His power moved like a hydraulic press, slow, methodical, unstoppable. Katie's nursing credentials were suspended by 5 o'clock on day 2. The official letter cited pending investigation into patient care violations during acute medical crisis. Hargrove delivered it himself, sliding it under her door while she was still on heavy narcotics, unable to fully comprehend what she was reading. Hospital policy requires immediate credential suspension pending board review, he said through the closed door, his voice smooth as oil. You're finished in medicine. Accept it. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it brought the entire hospital to its knees. The Black Hawks came at dawn on day 3 after the stabbing. 2 of them. The rotors shook the windows in the East Wing as they descended into the parking lot, sending dust and leaves spiraling across the asphalt like a tornado had touched down in the middle of Denver. News cameras were already rolling, someone had tipped the media, and they'd positioned themselves at the perimeter fence with zoom lenses ready. The hospital administrator watched from the window, his face going pale. He'd received a call 40 minutes earlier from someone identifying himself as a Navy 2-star admiral. The admiral had not asked for permission to land helicopters on hospital property. He'd informed the administrator that he was landing helicopters on hospital property. The SEAL team descended in full combat gear, tactical vests and rifle slings, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of operators who'd spent the last decade in active theaters. 30 of them. All of them. They walked through the main entrance like they owned the building, their boots striking the tile in perfect synchronization. 1, 2, 3, 4, a sound like a heartbeat getting louder. The front desk staff froze. One of the SEALs approached the receptionist, his voice clipped and professional. We need Senior Chief Morrison. Medical ward. Now. The receptionist's hands trembled as she reached for the phone. But Katie wasn't in the hospital anymore. She'd checked herself out against medical advice 6 hours earlier, before Hargrove could fabricate the next layer. The VA hospital. The place that still had her name in their system, buried under classified redactions. She was sitting in a waiting room surrounded by veterans when a Navy captain in dress blues found her, his presence suddenly filling the space like a pressure change in a plane cabin. He was tall enough to have to duck through the doorway. His eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, and he carried himself with the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed. Senior Chief Morrison. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of stone. I need you to come with me. Katie looked up. Her wound was bandaged but fresh, the pain medication making everything move in slow motion. She recognized the captain's insignia instantly, 3 silver oak leaves. Command authority. Real authority. Permission to ask where. Oak Creek Memorial. Your hospital needs you. The drive took 14 minutes. When Katie arrived, escorted in a military sedan with the seal on the door, the lobby had transformed. Navy personnel in dress uniforms were standing at attention. The hospital administrator was sweating through his shirt, his phone pressed to his ear. And Dr. Hargrove was standing in the center of the corridor, suddenly realizing that his network of golf buddies and friendly investigators meant absolutely nothing when the Pentagon was walking through the doors. The 2-star admiral entered the hospital like judgment itself had become corporeal. He was older, his uniform heavy with medals, his presence making the fluorescent light seem suddenly small and inadequate. Behind him came 3 officers with encrypted folders and expressions like granite. The admiral moved directly to the boardroom where Hargrove was waiting, where the 3 board members who'd golfed with him were suddenly understanding that they'd just made a very serious mistake. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, the admiral said, his voice steady as a rifle barrel. I'm Rear Admiral Thomas Castillo, Naval Special Warfare Command. I have a file here that needs your attention. Hargrove's jaw clenched. I'm not sure what. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Morrison. 3 bronze stars. The admiral paused, letting each word sit like a weight. 2 purple hearts. The board chairman's face went white. He was trying to do the math, trying to understand how the quiet nurse he'd known for 6 days could possibly have military decorations. Navy Cross for Valor in Marja, the admiral continued, his voice dropping half an octave. She held a perimeter alone for 40 minutes under sustained fire while extracting wounded personnel. Classified operation. Classified for a reason. Hargrove was shaking now. Not from fear, from rage at understanding that he'd been playing poker with someone holding a royal flush. And 2 days ago, the admiral said, she took a knife wound defending a Navy SEAL commander. She guided medical personnel through her own emergency care while losing consciousness. That's character. That's dedication. He placed the file on the table. That's also a federal offense to retaliate against, which is exactly what you've done. The phone on the wall buzzed. The hospital board chairman picked it up. Listened. His eyes went glassy. That was the Pentagon, he said quietly, his voice shaking like a man who'd just seen something that couldn't be unseen. He turned to Hargrove, and there was no mercy in his expression. You're terminated. Effective immediately. Hargrove stood up so fast his chair fell backward. You can't do this. I have contracts. I have affiliates. I have? You have federal investigators waiting in your office, one of the admiral's officers said. His tone suggested he was stating a fact, not a threat. Phantom billing codes. Ghost patients. 18 months of inflated charges running through the ICU, cross-referenced with shift schedules. We have everything. Hargrove's face went the color of old concrete. That's not, she was. Cleaning your mess, Katie said. She stood in the doorway of the boardroom, still in her hospital gown under a Navy-issued sweatshirt, her hand pressed to her bandaged side. Her voice was different now. The timid nurse was gone. This was the voice of someone who'd given orders under fire, who'd made decisions that meant the difference between living and dying. I found your codes on my 3rd day. 18 months of phantom procedures. You knew I was going to report it. So you tried to bury me first. Hargrove looked at her like she'd pulled a gun. But you made a mistake, the admiral said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage. You tried to silence a decorated war hero. And you did it in front of witnesses. 7 of them. All of them about to become federal witnesses. He turned to the hospital administrator. Dr. Hargrove's medical license is being revoked as of this moment. His credentials are flagged across every medical board in the country. The fraud charges will come later, but his career is over. Now, hospital security was already moving. They escorted Hargrove out of the boardroom, down the main corridor, past the staff gathered in shocked silence. The news cameras outside caught every second, the disgraced doctor being escorted from the building by security, his hands shaking, his suit suddenly looking cheap and worn. His face was red. His mouth was moving but no words were coming out. By the time he reached the parking lot, his professional life was already burning. The board members who'd golfed with him suddenly couldn't find his number in their phone. The investigators he'd brought in were themselves being questioned by federal agents. His colleagues sent terse emails declining to comment. His attorney called within 20 minutes, he had bigger problems now. The revocation was final. The fraud investigation was federal. There was no network to save him anymore. 6 months passed. Katie's credentials were restored within 72 hours. The stabbing wound healed cleanly, leaving a thin scar just below her ribs, another story her body could tell. She returned to Oak Creek Memorial, and this time the entire hospital knew exactly who was walking through the doors. On a clear afternoon in September, Katie stood at a Veterans Memorial dedication in downtown Denver, wearing her dress blues for the first time in 20 years. The uniform fit perfectly. Her medals were arranged in proper order on her chest, but it was the faded unit patch from Marja that caught the light, the one she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining all those years, waiting for the day she could wear it openly. It was pinned at her collar now, visible to anyone who looked. Commander Reeves stood beside her in his own dress blues, fully recovered, his hand resting on her shoulder with the weight of genuine brotherhood. A Marine corpsman named Torres appeared from the crowd, his uniform sharp enough to cut glass. "Senior Chief. Didn't know if you'd remember me," he said. "Second Battle of Fallujah," Katie said, and she smiled, a real smile, the kind she hadn't been able to show for years. "You held in 4 bag for 90 minutes under sniper fire." "That was a Tuesday," Torres said. The memorial was unveiled, a wall of names, granite and steel, each one representing someone who'd served and sacrificed. Many of the names belonged to people Katie had tried to save in operating rooms that didn't officially exist. Some of them she'd succeeded with. Others, she hadn't. But that was the weight of being a combat medic. You saved who you could. You carried who you couldn't. Commander Reeves stepped to the microphone. His voice carried across the gathering crowd, steady and clear. "We talk about warriors like they carry guns and wear flags on their sleeves. But some warriors wear scrubs. Some hold scalpels instead of rifles. Some save lives in places they're not supposed to exist." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped lower, heavier with meaning. "Senior Chief Morrison taught me something in that operating room. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." The crowd erupted in applause. Katie touched the patch on her chest, the faded fabric that had hidden her identity for so long, and finally let herself breathe. Across the street, barely visible through the crowd near the Memorial Garden entrance, Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table outside a grocery store. A cardboard sign read, "Supplemental insurance, ask about our plans." His suit was cheaper now, the kind you bought off a rack instead of from a tailor. His hands trembled as he shuffled brochures, trying to catch the eye of passing shoppers who walked past without stopping. Katie saw him. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. He looked away first. She didn't need to do anything. The Pentagon had already made sure his license was revoked, his reputation destroyed, his network dismantled. The insurance company that hired him didn't know his history, he was just another rep with a folding table and desperate eyes. But that was exactly the point. He'd gone from a doctor with power and fraud and golf buddies to a man selling insurance to people who didn't want it, in front of a grocery store, watching the woman he'd tried to bury receive a standing ovation for her service. Justice didn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looked like a quiet morning, a pension gone, a career ended, and the simple knowledge that you'd lost everything while the person you tried to destroy got it all back. Katie turned back to the memorial. Torres was telling her a story about someone they'd both known, someone whose name was carved into the granite. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from deeper than just her throat. It came from the part of her that had finally come home. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, like and subscribe for more stories about people who rose above it. Comment below, what would you have done in Katie's position? And hit the notification bell so you never miss a story about the quiet warriors walking among us.